Well, greetings. This is Dr. Dean Blevins, or Pastor Dean Blevins. I'm the discipleship pastor at Kansas City First Church. And continuing a series looking sort of at what I might call discipleship moments, and opportunities to reflect on discipleship and particularly look at our own lives during this season of Lent, a time when Jesus sort of leaves Galilee, sets his face toward Jerusalem, and then calls people that really want to follow him to truly be his disciples. Now, we have been looking at this journey together primarily through the lens of the disciples, the first 12 disciples, though, as I've said, we're going to expand on that before it's over. And this time, what I would like to do is really focus more on the other two brothers that are a part of the 12 disciples, who are James and John. We've looked at Andrew and Peter. This time we'll take a look at James and John. There is some interesting sort of preliminary thoughts about these two brothers. One, they're the sons of Zebedee, and it seems as if Zebedee had some affluence, and at least he was able to hire servants to help in his fishing business. We know that from the first chapter of Mark. And that it's interesting that James is actually listed as the first of the two brothers that sort of meets with Jesus. And then, interestingly enough, he sort of drops to the background and we learn more about John. And we'll come back to each of them individually in just a minute. As brothers, it is probably one of the things I always enjoy about these, where these obviously were men of great passion. Jesus himself would give them the nickname Sons of Thunder in Mark chapter 3, and they earned it. They earned that nickname pretty well, both in their desire at one point to call down fire upon a village. That's in Luke chapter 9. But also, the more interesting story happens in Matthew 20 is when these brothers' mother, not father, but mother, actually approaches Jesus and says, I want you to do something for me, which is to put my two boys on your right and left hand when you sort of come into and assume your kingdom. Of course, Jesus asked, do you really know what you're asking for when he's speaking to the mother? But obviously the boys are more than happy to sort of assume those roles. Out of these stories, you probably would begin to think that what we have is actually a couple of, well, probably exuberant, somewhat hot-headed young men, maybe a bit of mama's boys, if you stop and think about it, who've had maybe a little bit more affluence than other people, though they were fishermen. And so, in our society, kind of spoiled frat boy with doting mother would probably be one way to think about them. Since I grew up in the South, and Southern boys always had doting mothers, it'd be a pretty interesting way of thinking about who these two young men were in sort of their everyday lives. But it's pretty obvious that that's not the life that they continued to follow. As a matter of fact, we do know that John, who does become the more evident and more well-known of the two, is understood as the beloved, the one whom Jesus loves. And that we also know that both James and John were able to be at Jesus' Transfiguration, one of the most tremendous moments in this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And they were able to see Jesus in the fullness of his splendor right alongside Peter. And they were a part of that inner circle to observe a number of different types of miracles. And the famous story that we also know is that following Jesus' resurrection, Peter and John race back to the empty tomb, and in John, he just sort of casually reminds everyone he gets there first. So maybe some of the exuberance of these two brothers still kind of flow through, but it's very obvious that John grows to be the sort of the disciple who becomes the apostle of love, and his emphasis is on really us loving one another later in his messages and letters that he would write from 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It's also important to keep James in mind. Though James doesn't get the same emphases, he is a leader in the early church. He is a part of those same transformative moments to be around Jesus in the fullness of his glory. Interesting enough, He is also in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus, and he is actually the first of the apostles, not as the disciples become the apostles. He's the first of the apostles that we know to have been martyred when he is beheaded. And we find that in Acts chapter 12. And so he has quite a role in leadership, obviously, in the early church in Jerusalem, and enough so that he gains the attention of Herod and also the wrath of Herod. Now, when you stop and think about both of these young men becoming later in lives, well, just passionate followers of Jesus, taking that exuberance and passion and having it molded into love and leadership, taking whatever sense of entitlement they might have had through their father's wealth or their mother's desires for them, and transforming that into a way of, well, taking that and shifting it to be a true desire for Jesus and a true desire to follow Jesus and to become leaders as a result of that. These are two young men worth paying attention to. My own life, since I'm a single child, so I've never had a sibling, though I actually have had a relative, a cousin, who might as well be a brother to me. And I have to say, to share those kinds of sibling bonds, to be close together, either a brother to a brother or a brother to a sister or sister to sister, is probably a pretty amazing thing. And to be able to literally be in the very transforming presence of Jesus, to be at the Mount of Transfiguration and to see fully who Jesus is and what he represents as truly the Son of God, must have been a life-altering moment. So I'd invite you to reflect on that. How is it that your own passions, your own exuberance can be sometimes aligned the wrong way, demonstrating anger or entitlement? But how can those passions be transformed through the very presence of Jesus in the right ways? When have there been mountaintop moments in your life when Jesus truly becomes alive and aware? If that's not happened, I pray that that moment might happen in the next part of your own journey. These two young disciples are yet just one more example of what it means to follow Jesus and to allow even the most exuberant, passionate, most entitled or angry parts of our lives to be totally transformed in the very presence of Jesus, and then to live ourselves out fully for Jesus in everything that we do. Well, I hope this has been a helpful devotion, and we'll look forward to seeing you again as we continue to explore the disciples during this period of time. Blessings to you.